הרשות הרביעית, מאת דוקטור אלון גלעדי. פרק א'. מדוע הרשות הרביעית? מסגרת הגותית. שער שני, מתוך מבנה המדינה. רביעי. בגלל הצורך במסקנה מוסדית ברורה למימוש העקרון הדמוקרטי בהגותו של מונטסקיה, במדינה הליברלית-דמוקרטית, בנוגע לסוגיית הפערים החברתיים. כללי.
The name of Montesquieu is identified with the principle of the separation of powers, which was explicitly adopted by the founders of the American nation toward the end of the 18th century. But this principle constituted only one and partial chapter of Montesquieu's full book, The Spirit of the Laws, and as such, it discussed only the characterization of the only state of his time whose basis was political liberty. Not for nothing did most discussions ignore Montesquieu's brilliant and forward-looking analysis regarding the principle standing behind the democratic regime, which is, according to him, the principle of equality. This aspect of his thought, from the American context and application, was reviewed extensively at a later stage by de Tocqueville in the mid-19th century. In this chapter, I will argue that specifically an institution like the Fourth Branch has the capacity to answer the problems Montesquieu identified in the danger of the corruption of the democratic liberal society. Regarding the laws derived from these two components of it, as one who did not see the manner of his theory's application. This manner, with its democratic disadvantages, was revealed through the practical analyses of his conceptual successors, Madison and de Tocqueville, the one before and during the American Revolution, and the other from a more distant perspective, though much closer to those early days than our own days. Montesquieu, analyzing all types of regimes of his time, determines that in a democracy, the people rule. Therefore, together with the power of laws and the arm, one must integrate the integrity of virtues, for the regime is entrusted to every citizen, and without the good virtues, namely, love of the laws and the homeland, this regime will not be established. The meaning of the love of democracy is the love of equality and contentment with little, since every man is supposed to enjoy the same happiness and the same advantages, as well as to taste the same pleasures and nurture the same hopes that the other is entitled to. All these cannot be achieved by nurturing the passion for ownership beyond the needs and the desired abundance in the homeland that characterizes, nor by extreme equality, the corruption of democracy and its failure. In order to establish equality and democracy, Montesquieu suggests educating the citizens, dividing the lands, according to the good measure, in an egalitarian and primary way into small units, and guaranteeing the persistence of the division by suitable laws. For otherwise, inequality will return anew, and the republic will be lost. And with this, he is aware that true equality is difficult to achieve, and therefore the optimum model, which perhaps is possible during revolutions or historical transformations, and even can cause the destruction of the social structure in normal times, gives way to the proposal for the establishment of an additional branch, a council of elders. If the principle of equality is what characterizes democracy, then the principle of political liberty is what characterizes the English democracy. The danger to political liberty is in the tendency of man to abuse the authority given to him and to expand it without limit. Therefore, in a regime based on political liberty, it is appropriate that this danger be limited. Since in every state there are, according to his method, three branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, Montesquieu seeks to examine how the preservation of political liberty is expressed in the only state that put it as a candle to its feet, England. And according to him, the central expression of this preservation is in the separation of powers. My argument in this work will be that the Fourth Branch is indeed that same council, that same separate house, Montesquieu, Ibid, 151-155, with the changes necessitated by modern reality, which are required, according to Montesquieu, for the existence of democracy and political liberty together, within a framework of separation of powers. This conclusion is also reflected from an analysis of the positions of Madison and of de Tocqueville, which seemingly complement each other from different perspectives and for different motives, in the same application context, while also highlighting the deficiencies compared to Montesquieu's more complete theory. Madison's reference to Montesquieu's ideas actually came to establish foundations for the structure of the new American government, while preserving the spirit of political liberty at the base of the revolution, simultaneously with preserving the existing property in the hands of its owners from the structural aspect. In any case, Madison's articles in The Federalist are aimed on the one hand at the separation of powers, though not absolute separation, by proving the danger inherent in leaving it in identical hands, and according to the experience of the colonies up to his time. On the other hand, he seeks to examine how liberty can be protected precisely from democracy, meaning the preservation of the existing proprietary situation and focusing on the danger of factionalism, divisiveness, and instability, as he explicitly notes that the causes of factionalism are rooted in human nature, and its most frequent and persistent source is the unequal distribution of property as a factor leading to the fact that property owners and those without property have different and even opposing interests. But Madison did not seek to correct the situation and its causes, but rather to prevent its dangerous results for the government by a procedural substantive regulation, namely, separation between the people and the government through their elected representatives and by their multiplicity and dispersal among the various states to prevent the accumulation of too much power against the federal authority. The lack in the democratic discussion reflected from Madison's articles, namely in Montesquieu's principle of equality, is completed by de Tocqueville's famous book about democracy in America. In this composition, in which he predicts the future success of democracy in the United States and among other nations, de Tocqueville seeks to discern what are the reasons for the success of democracy in America and what is its influence on the lives of the citizens, their concepts, and their virtues, in order to project from these conclusions onto Europe. First, this author starts from Montesquieu's point of view, according to which the principle guiding the American citizens, perhaps as distinguished from their founders, is not liberty, but first and foremost equality. Equality of opportunity, equality of conditions, equality of general outlooks, and all this about 60 years after the Revolution. And from here, that in practice there remained no control by the wealthy minority over the means of production, as well as over the government, which was held by the poor specifically, and the possibilities for education and assets remained equal. To the equality in social living conditions and to the checking of the possibility of the tyranny of the majority and the general government were added, according to de Tocqueville, the Americans' tendency toward suspicion toward the government and mainly unlimited association, out of a principle of self-government and an awareness of political liberty in the small territory, in the personal life space. Through this, awareness was developed out of self-interest for belonging and community activity, as well as a break on the corruption of both democracy and political liberty together. But at this point, one must stop, since all the factual impressions and the conclusions derived from them by de Tocqueville, their strength was perhaps good for the year 1831, but not for our own days. Assets and education are not equal. Wealth passes and accumulates from generation to generation. The gaps between most of the population and the minority are immense. The vast and empty spaces are no more, and control over the mechanisms of government is not in the hands of the poor, but specifically and perhaps only in the hands of the wealthy minority. The days of the Enlightened Revolution and the first pioneering are no more. The correction of this situation, from a projection to the procedural, substantive heritage of Montesquieu and his successors, returns us to the procedural and structural proposals enumerated by him, and to my proposal in this work, which will embody, I claim, the practical lessons raised in the writings of his conceptual successors, as well as cope with possible objections from the direction of their thought toward this proposal.
לא תיתכן מסקנה ברורה מסוגה של הרשות הרביעית לעיקרון לא ברור. על אי-התאמתו של עקרון הדמוקרטיה הכללי לפתרון בעיית הפערים החברתיים.
Montesquieu does not clearly define what that same equality is which stands at the base of the rule of the people. From his words, it is evident that it concerns both equality from the realm of liberty, for example, equality in the right to vote and in the right to be elected, and material equality. It seems that he deduces these principles in a deductive manner from the linguistic conceptual definition of democracy, which is contrary, even according to his method, to all those practical applications of the rule of the people that never implemented that same absolute principle of equality of which he seemingly speaks, not in Rome and not in Greece, and certainly not in England. In the very same breath, he claims that this substantive equality cannot be achieved because its implementation is likely to constitute a danger to stability, to the very foundations of the government. For example, if the state redistributes private property anew in an equal manner among the citizens, as distinguished from a situation of the beginning of the Republic's founding, because in the people's state, the people are divided into several classes when the duration of the existence and prosperity of democracy depend on this division. From here, the claim can be refuted according to which a clear institution of the kind of the fourth branch should be established, in direct and/or indirect action according to the principle of equality in democracy, at a time when this principle is not clear and even its implementation is doubted by Montesquieu himself. To answer this claim, it is worthy, first of all, and as a matter of importance to note that indeed Montesquieu does not require a definition of equality. His interest is not in defining the objects of the analysis, but in finding the laws, the relations between the objects in their ideal sense, which includes the aspects of the principle of the proper measure detailed above. From this perspective, it can seemingly be argued that the modern relation to Western democracy as well is not a product of the definition of democracy as such, for example, as rule of the people, rule of the majority, etc., but examines this form of regime according to the relations by which it is characterized. For example, due to the answer to the problem which this form of regime seeks to cope with, like the solution of conflicts in a fair manner, for example, through majority rule regarding general decisions and civil rights regarding particular decisions. Furthermore, it can become and argued that a negative definition of this sort is more suitable for the analysis of modern democracy than for the analysis that preceded the formation of Western democracy, and relied on examples primarily from ancient times. But the lack in the negative modern definition of democracy, from Montesquieu's point of view, is in my opinion in its being seemingly descriptive contemporary, and therefore detached from the past and the future, toward which and from which democracy developed, and which are subject, at least according to Montesquieu, to fixed laws which must be discovered, especially due to the severe implications upon deviation from them. Therefore, in the broad, inclusive sense, consistent with the spirit of the laws according to Montesquieu, the negative definition of the principle guiding the positive development of democracy from its very built-in and mandatory nature, namely, the entire people as sovereign, upon which it can be assumed that there is seemingly agreement even today, is a definition which it can be argued that its negative modern sense is included within it in a manner that is not sufficiently exhaustive, that does not settle fully with its boundaries. The reason for this is, among other things, in the absence of a basic anchoring, a built-in, directed starting point for this negative definition, like sovereignty/rule of the people, or because it actually constitutes a negative definition from the realm of liberty and not from the realm of substantive equality, which both constitute the whole regarding the essence of democracy. Certainly, it does not ignore the aspects of substantive equality. Western democracy as it is today, at least according to the assumptions of this work, is consistent with Montesquieu's assumptions regarding the processes of democracy's disintegration. The principle he outlines regarding good virtues, political virtues in a republic, is a guiding principle, a principle of feeling, of behavior, and not of definition or knowledge. A principle that is between the laws, between the objects, in the spirit of the laws, a principle that should be aspired to without requiring a detailed definition of the objects themselves, something which will strengthen democracy and advance it toward harmony and stability in accordance with its own nature. This progress ought to be made in a gradual, educated manner, unless it concerns the primary steps of a republic, or when the degree of corruption is so great. Then even the wealthy will understand, according to Montesquieu, that there is no escape from a radical distribution of goods in society, for it is inconceivable that the individual would waive his equal right to happiness to another in a state where the entire people is the ruler. Any other argument contradicts, according to Montesquieu, democracy at its core. But even this distribution will not avail over time to prevent the disintegration of democracy if laws consistent with the super-principle of integrity of virtues, as defined by Montesquieu, are not legislated. Montesquieu's view on its primacy seems to me relevant, perhaps more than ever, to the matter of the development and decline of Western democracy. It seems that Montesquieu, in language than which there is none clearer, seeks to argue that all those phenomena of corruption, pursuit of money, and the aspiration to belong to that same milieu that exploits the rest in the name of the good life, of the lack of contentment with little, of nurturing those same values that are opposed to good virtues, all these are phenomena symbolizing the disintegration of democracy, if not in the immediate range, then in the days to come, and this because they gnaw at and harm its distinct foundation, the being of the entire people, the sovereign. Montesquieu's solutions for correcting this situation range from radical acts such as redistribution of lands in an egalitarian manner, and preferably as small as possible, or setting a capital quota that is not to be exceeded, to gradual actions such as education toward contentment with little, legislation of specific laws to reduce social gaps by imposing taxes on the wealthy and providing allowances to the poor. But Montesquieu himself is aware that outlining the way is not sufficient in a democracy in which a rule and practice of property owners exists, since there is no certainty that the derivatives for all the good virtues can be implemented in the democratic state as it is. In the state it has reached, he proposes the establishment of that same Council of Elders which I mentioned in the above analysis. But that same Council of Elders without the power derived from the will of the people, which has the capacity to grant it real authority, is likely to be likened to known toothless institutions such as the State Controller's Office and others, which represent a certain aspect of that same concept of good virtues, but do not have the capacity to bring about a real change, more or less gradual, within the framework of the formal, substantive procedures in democracy. Nevertheless, that same Council of Elders, as a yardstick for good virtues, is required according to Montesquieu to cling to ancient traditions and customs, and this out of the assumption that at its beginning, at its base, the democratic society was healthy and was corrupted during the many years of an aging regime with its new customs. Faithful to the principle of good virtues, Montesquieu seeks the impossible, the detachment of a council of elders from the instructions and wishes of the people. He does not take into account the possibility of corruption of that council itself, as far as it concerns its members themselves, or those entering their homes, or the influence of capital owners upon them. A council that is detached from the people, its members elected for life, whose old age alone is what guarantees their action, and all this based on ancient customs that are not clear what they are, is not in the nature of a clear institutional solution to the question of social gaps, as well as to the problem of the existence and preservation of the principle of good virtues. Therefore, it seems to me that the need for the establishment of the fourth branch in adjustment to the principle of good virtues has not been refuted, in adjustment to Montesquieu's proposal for the establishment of a council of elders, which will labor over the dissemination and emphasis of those same virtues in the democratic society.
הדמוקרטיות השונות. על אי ההתאמה שבין עקרון הדמוקרטיה הכללי ומסקנתו המוסדית ליסודות הדמוקרטיה החופשית מעשית, לרבות המסחרית.
Montesquieu himself recognizes that the full implementation of the principle of good virtues is in practice impossible. And these matters emerge explicitly when he seeks to examine its implementation on the possible types of democracy. Especially for our concern, the issue of the operation of the commercial democracy arises in its severity. that which is founded upon commerce, or in other words, upon private initiative, upon free competition. And not for nothing does he choose to characterize the super principle in the only democracy of his time according to political liberty, and not according to the principle of good virtues. From here arises the conclusion that those same good virtues are likely to change, at least in a specific manner, in accordance with the character of the society in question. And therefore, there is no necessity for the establishment of a separate branch which will be required for the implementation of this principle. Thus, in a commercial society, it is certainly possible that material equality will not be realized, and there will be individuals in it possessing great capital, but the virtues will not be corrupted, because the spirit of commerce brings with it the spirit of contentment with little, frugality, moderation, diligence, calculated caution, tranquility, order, and law. The meaning of these things is that a different type of equality is possible in democracy. Equality before the law, which allows free commerce, without limiting the possibility for accumulation of property, which even constitutes a catalyst for individual efforts that benefit the collective. Political equality, voting, candidacy, expression, equality before the law, etc., are the values that characterize equality in commercial democracy, and therefore, there is no place in a society of this type for a solution of the kind of the fourth branch, at least as far as matters concern the institutional implementation of the principle of good virtues. Indeed, the practical meaning of the principle of good virtues is likely to change according to the type of society in which democracy, in its sense of the rule of the people, is led. But even in the commercial democracy, in order for the spirit of commerce in accordance with this principle to be preserved, there is a need for integration, according to Montesquieu, between its preservation by the leaders of the citizens themselves, the leaders of civil society, and its strengthening by the laws. But beyond this, Montesquieu emphasizes that this spirit must prevail alone and not mingle with another spirit, and that the laws will be outlined with the trend toward redistribution of property to the extent that commerce increases it, and to grant, on the one hand, sufficient welfare to every poor citizen so that he can work like the others, and on the other hand, to deplete every wealthy citizen to the extent that will force him to work for the sake of preserving his property or for the sake of accumulating new property. From all these you learn that according to Montesquieu, the spirit of commerce requires in democracy both a civil and a legal coping as one, in order to prevent the implications of the accumulation of great wealth in the hands of individuals. And even if the values of free commerce give it its uniqueness, ignoring the totality of aspects of the principle of good virtues is likely to lead democracy toward its practical or declarative end. From here it emerges that contentment within the framework of commercial democracy, with the integration between free competition and formal equality before the law, is not sufficient for the preservation of the principle of good virtues adjusted to this type of the people's regime. And even in this argument, there is nothing to refute the proposal placed at the foundation of this work.
שוויון אידיאלי ומעשי. על אי התאמת העיקרון הכללי ליציבותה של הדמוקרטיה ההמונית המעשית.
Another argument from Montesquieu's direction concerns the issue of the stability of the capitalist democracy against the background of the need for the comprehensive implementation of the principle of good virtues. As could be seen until now, time after time, Montesquieu seeks to emphasize that a direct, extreme, rapid, revolutionary implementation of the distributive aspects of the principle of good virtues is likely to lead to the collapse of the entire regime. As noted above, an implementation of this kind could be consistent with the beginning of the Republic, but this within a legal fabric that will not allow its corruption due to the lack of strictness regarding the principle of good virtues, which is unavoidable without legal treatment in this matter. Such an implementation could be considered also at a time when the Republic has been corrupted to such an extent that the exploitation and the gaps in it are so great, until almost a consensus will exist among all the class parts of the people regarding the need for a drastic distributive change. From this point of view, it can be argued that the fourth branch is in the nature of a change to the foundations of the regime, a drastic, extreme step, while the middle ways seemingly proposed by Montesquieu himself can be used, whether through progressive taxation, or taxation on capital, or distribution of vacant lands, or allowances to the poor, etc. Legal steps within the framework of the existing regime, which will be taken in a gradual and democratic manner toward change, adjusted to the aspiration for the establishment of the principle of good virtues. This is a solution that fits the thought of Montesquieu, which sought a structural solution in society for its degeneration, in accordance with the relations between the people, and not in accordance with the people themselves. Thus, for example, regarding democracy and aristocracy, of which he believes that liberty does not come to them in a natural way. Out of a desire to achieve that same political liberty, as for example in the commercial states, he cannot and does not seek to cancel the principle of virtues, for this is a basic rule in democracy, and therefore he seeks to require a structural solution that maintains the principle of good virtues in the various societies out of the spirit of the laws and not the laws themselves. The answer to this claim is integrated. First, it will be said that the fourth branch is not in the nature of a revolution, but a corrective step on the basis of the existing regime. This is a step that must be accepted and performed within the framework of a democratic process and regime. It does not cancel the existing institutions, and also not at once the class situation, but rather it has the capacity to act in a gradual, orderly, democratic, competitive manner as one, to build a modern institutional fabric which will serve the society in a built-in, orderly way, embedded in its comprehensive democratic principles, toward an educated exit in the direction of the implementation of the principle of good virtues. Second, it can be said that, in accordance with the basic assumptions of this work, the continuation of the process of expanding gaps, especially in an era of technology and increased globalization, which were not valid and existing at the current level in Montesquieu's days, is likely to lead to severe instability within the capitalist democracy, and perhaps also outside of it, after passing a certain point of no return, assuming it has not yet arrived. Since the middle ways, and certainly the extreme ways which have been tried until now in this context have failed, and since we are situated in practice in an era that tends toward extremism regarding the manner of conduct of the democratic liberal regime, the neoliberal in socio-economic issues, in generalization, and with such or other small differences between the states, this argument seems to have been refuted.
מדיסון, דה טוקוויל, ואנלוגיה אמפירית היסטורית של עקרון המידות הטובות.
A final argument to which I will attend in this chapter comes from the empirical historical direction. The arguer will argue that empirically, that same principle which stands before Montesquieu at the base of democracy, in its comprehensive meaning, as determining the fate of democracy, whether toward corruption and disintegration, or toward success, or slowing the process of degeneration, according to which the need for the establishment of a separate branch required for its execution can be argued, has been proven wrong. And behold, it is commonly assumed that the development of American democracy, whose foundation is explicitly not in property and distributive equality, but rather in the freedom of commerce and the protection of property existing in the hands of capital owners and the aspiration to be counted among them, has proven itself. First of all, and as a matter of importance, that same America, which saw fit to annex to itself Montesquieu's ideas in the field of separation of powers, but not in the distributive field, became the sole superpower within a process of globalization adjusted to the dominance and hegemony of this power. Those same equality arrangements, both in the people's democracies and certainly in the Western social democracies, have withered and faded away in all their various forms. The world has become more and more democratic in Madison's format and not in the format of Montesquieu and de Tocqueville. As an answer to this claim, it is worthy to attend to the arguments of Madison and de Tocqueville in an analogous manner to our concern. The analyses of Madison and de Tocqueville, together with Montesquieu's theory, constitute a fabric of empirical and conceptual analysis as one for the purpose of drawing conclusions regarding the structural need for the fourth branch or its refutation. Montesquieu shaped the basic principles for the structure of democracy and the free state from a preliminary point of view, namely, before checking a modern practical application of the spirit of these laws. From a historical aspect, Madison's composition is situated at a more advanced stage between the descriptive stage and the practical stage, as well as the beginning of that same stage. Madison seeks to shape the constitutional structure of the consolidating American Republic while placing emphasis on the character of its components, the various states already existing upon their constitutional structure between the federal and the national, and the need for the existence of political liberty as a super principle and the structural derivative of the state's constitutions, as well as emphasis on the need for social and governmental stability. These goals of liberty and stability will be achieved according to Madison under the influence of Montesquieu, through their direct influence on the structure of the Republic, namely, not only separation of powers, but also their design, which in adjustment to the basic principles will be done in a gradual and corrective as well as decisive manner against the constitutions of the existing states. De Tocqueville, checking the development of American democracy about 60 years after its founding, concentrates, contrary to Madison, not on the aspects of liberty and stability, but on the democratic aspect of Montesquieu's theory from the direction of substantive equality. De Tocqueville claims that in this state, due to its special conditions, a combined application of both liberty and equality as one exists, when the latter, similar to Montesquieu, is in the sense of the principle of substantive equality as a substantive basis for the development and vitality of democracy, and in complete contradiction to Madison, who ignored it apparently in a deliberate manner. From an analysis of the researches of these scholars, it emerges that the argument brought at the opening of this chapter not only does not stand in line with the basic assumptions of this work, but it is even refuted in itself in relation to the bases of Montesquieu's own analysis. Madison's America is that same republic in the beginning of its days. That is to say, despite a full non-implementation, at least from the declarative aspect, of Montesquieu's principle of virtues, and despite the apparent protection of the status of money owners, without entering now into the issue of slavery. Behold, as I have already noted above, in those days there was nothing in this to contradict the spirit of commerce, the spirit of freedom and equality of opportunity as detailed in such a comprehensive manner in de Tocqueville's composition, which places emphasis exactly on that same spirit, on those same virtues, on the disdain for money owners, on the pioneering, on the land of unlimited opportunities for personal development. But the way of every regime that deviates from its basic principle, according to Montesquieu, be it democratic, aristocratic, or other, is toward degeneration, corruption, and disintegration. The comparison between those days of beginning and pioneering of Madison and de Tocqueville and the basic assumptions of this work teaches that, at least according to Montesquieu's idea, that same Western democracy which is not conducted according to the comprehensive aspects of the principle of good virtues, and especially regarding its distributive aspects, does not stand that same empirical historical test. According to the basic assumptions of this work, Western democracy is situated today in the midst of the process of its disintegration, expressed today from an internal perspective in the increasing gaps and from an external perspective in the multiplicity of attacks upon it in an era of weapons of mass destruction. This unavoidable process can be slowed through a gradual regimal change of this type proposed in this work, especially since most other changes from this point of view have failed. The manner of the requested structural change can be learned from an integrated analogy to the action of Madison and de Tocqueville in relation to Montesquieu's research from the structural perspective, namely, learning from the existing constitutions in the various Western states and designing a different structure in adjustment to Montesquieu's central principles, but this time, while integrating a basic structural preliminary between the aspects of democratic equality and political liberty, an integration that will not leave its actions solely to the subjective conditions in which the United States was situated and which allowed the development of democracy even in a government division that tilted toward the direction of liberty and stability. In the absence of a suitable structural change or correction, it is not possible, in the natural changing of these conditions, to prevent its degeneration. The structural change must, as a derivative of what is stated in this chapter, in a basic way, act in adjustment to the basic principles of liberal democracy, meaning to be realized and shaped in a particular manner, in accordance with the character and circumstances of each and every society, while structural completion from the direction of liberty in a society where the emphasis is democratic, and structural completion from the direction of equality in a society where the emphasis is neoliberal.
5. בגלל החוסר במסקנה מוסדית ברורה לבעיית הפערים החברתיים במדינה האידיאלית, לפי הגל, אל מול פתרונו של רוסו.
The proposed fourth branch is part of the modern, democratic liberal state. As such, it is appropriate to examine its integration with central liberal theories regarding the essence of the state. As a product of a social contract, as a result of the general will, the will of the individuals, or as an ideal of the objective will, standing as it is beyond a subjective particular interest or point of view.
רוסו, בגלל הרצון הכללי.
Rousseau's innovation, as opposed to Locke, and as distinguished from utilitarian views, is in his search for the preservation of the individual's liberty within the governmental framework. Rousseau agrees that the natural man seeks to protect his body and his property while preserving his natural liberty, and he hands over this protection to the partnership he establishes. However, according to Rousseau, he remains an integral part of this partnership. The partnership constitutes in practice an embodiment of his own will, so that when he obeys its laws, he is in practice obeying himself and remains free as he was before. Not only is his liberty preserved, but it is now civil, which is more sublime and more moral than his natural liberty, since it contains, beyond the self-dimension, the private will or its sum, also a dimension of partnership brought to balance in the general will. The general will, the rational good common to the collective, is not dictated from above. It is not the fruit of the decision of such or another individual, but rather it is the collection of private wills while neutralizing the advantages and disadvantages they embody for each and every individual. As such, Rousseau determines that the ideal state is that in which the citizens are not associated at all and do not negotiate, and they decide together on their affairs. Thus, through the small differences between the private wills that neutralize each other, the implementation of the general will is enabled, as opposed to a situation in which society is divided into a small number of partial partnerships. Then, when one of the partnerships is larger to the extent of overcoming the others, its will becomes the decisive opinion and the general will is cancelled before the private will of this partnership. Therefore, if there is a place for partial partnerships in society, they should be increased while reducing their power as separate units for the purpose of receiving the weighted general will. Rousseau recognizes the problem of socio-economic inequality, but he does not dedicate a specific solution to it since, according to his method, it is supposed to find its solution in a regime of equal civil liberty, a regime conducted according to the rational general will. In such a regime, there is no place for social gaps which are signs of a bad regime where equality is feigned and the laws always benefit the one who has property and harm the one who has nothing. A beneficial social situation is that when everyone has something and no one has anything superfluous. Rousseau identifies, like Locke, the problem of inequality as a destructive combination of reason, passion, and property that can be accumulated, which turn the legitimate government into arbitrary and the man into a slave. This severe situation is identified by him with the governmental division of the state structure between the prince, the aristocracy, and the people, which was one of the hallmarks of his time. Therefore, his solution is also found in the procedural structure of the good regime with moral liberty at its center. Instead of a division of an absolute prince, the aristocracy, and the people, he seeks now to overturn and change the order fundamentally to the people through the legislative branch, the executive branch, and a prince as a mediator, when all are supposed to act in accordance with the general will. A bad regime is characterized by a conduct acting according to the interests of such or another group, enabling through the laws the increase of the power of the wealthy and the injury of the poor. In order to correct an action of this type embedded in an improper relation between parts of society, he seeks on the one hand to disperse the power between the branches in a proportional manner, and on the other hand, if this matter is not sufficient, to establish, renew a special officership that shall be separate from the others, originating in the classical Roman tribunate. Its role shall be to restore the proper relation between the various links, as a mediating link between the prince, the people, and the sovereign. It is not of the constituent parts of the city and has no power to act but only to delay, while the number of its members is limited, and it will act at fixed intervals that can be shortened for the purpose of limiting its power. Rousseau is therefore aware of the problem of socio-economic inequality, whose solution will come, according to his method, in a government which will act according to the general will, while standing on guard of civil liberty through a multiplicity of equal partnerships and a mediating authority during disorders between parts of the people. In this work, I will argue that the fourth branch is indeed that same officership authority, but specifically in the more classical guise, as actually representing the interest and needs of the majority of the population, the lower and middle classes, which are the weak classes in society. And not in its seemingly neutral sense of Rousseau, which perhaps would have suited an ideal situation in which the forces are situated in an initial state, possessing reduced inequality gaps, as for example after a revolution that changes world orders, but not in a realistic and reasonable situation as one in which one class, for example, the wealthy bourgeois, the owner of the means of production, buys for itself direct and indirect control over all the others, as was assumed at the beginning of this work.
הגנה או פיקוח על החוקים, על מעמדה של הרשות הרביעית ביחס לרצון הפרטים.
First and foremost, it is worthy, in my view, to attend to the argument against the establishment of the fourth branch from a basic conceptual aspect of Rousseau's theory. Rousseau argues that the will of individuals will be embodied in the actions and decisions of the state through the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The tribunate is not a body reflecting the will of individuals, but rather the opinion of experts. It comes to solve problems of lack of balance between the constituent bodies of the city and was intended first and foremost, according to Rousseau, to preserve the laws and the legislative branch, and not to supervise them or intervene in them. Rousseau seeks to prevent at any cost the possibility of establishing an institution which, by its very definition, contains a danger of violating the infrastructure of the social contract. That is to say, in order to correct the relationship that was breached between the parts of the city, there is a need for an action that does not derive directly from the will of individuals. It is a directed institution, an institution that protects the existing laws, but in no way an institution that supervises the laws. Rousseau seeks to restrain the danger inherent in an institution of this type, even before it is established, due to his fear of institutional action not according to the will of individuals, the will of the people, and the institutions of the contract, and the establishment of a tyrannical rule in the name of the people's good, as determined by experts and not elected officials. Therefore, Rousseau requests that the tribunate be determined by law for fixed periods, such that will not allow it within their framework to seize by a strong hand what is not its own, and on the other hand, in a way that will not allow corruptions in society to take root. Furthermore, the design of the institutions is done out of the concrete character of the society, of the specific individuals and the conditions in which they act. Nevertheless, according to Rousseau, there are two fundamental conditions that guarantee the establishment of institutions which will reflect the will of the sovereign, the people, which is ambivalent and not uniform. And they are relative equality, not formal but substantive, and the absence of factionalism in accordance with the local conditions. The need for similar conditions in which individuals in different places meet the government's tendency, especially in large states, toward increased oppression and centralization for the purpose of effective control, if not for other foreign reasons. For, as noted above, the best government is the aristocratic one, and the worst sovereign is the aristocracy. This tendency can be moderated by means that cannot be realized in practice by a mediating factor without real powers or by the existing institutions, especially due to the contradictory tendencies of the sovereign and the government, which lead in a built-in manner to the degeneration of society and the tendency of every private will to overcome the general one. The answer to this claim will naturally be in those same reservations of Rousseau himself that received expression above. First of all, the role of the tribunate, as we saw above, is not to preserve the laws, but to preserve and channel the state authorities toward the proper proportional relationship of their power, and within this framework, to protect the legislative branch, but sometimes also the prince or the people, according to the circumstances. Beyond that, one must agree with Rousseau's position that if the society becomes such that enables the continued existence of social gaps, and even their ongoing and expanding deepening, where those same basic institutions of the social contract enable the rich to rob the poor and to provide for the rich, not what is necessary for his livelihood, but much, much beyond that, in a reality in which that poor person or middle-class person lives a life of poverty, distress, and survival, then the correction for the situation must come through an institution whose power and authority come from the people, whether in a direct manner or in an indirect manner. And behold, Rousseau himself believes, as stated, that the elected aristocracy is the best form of government, but the worst for the essence of the sovereign. Indeed, in order to cancel Rousseau's fears, which, by the way, are different from the examples he presents, it is worthy, in my view, that this institution not be detached from the will of individuals, from that same constitutive social contract. It also cannot harm the principle of separation of powers, which also stands at the base of the democratic regime and in the sovereign's ability to will and to act as one. But Rousseau is in a paradox, for he seeks to correct the situation into which society is drawn in a built-in way, in a manner that will not sabotage its essence, namely, in the sovereignty of the people, in its system of laws. And on the other hand, he believes that the correction must be by an external body, which could at the necessary time also act for the benefit of the executive branch, according to the reasons that caused this situation. Therefore, it seems to me that in a built-in manner, there exists a preference for the existence of an additional body between the state authorities, which will enable the correction of the lack of proportions in a built-in and not external way, namely through a competitive, checking, balancing, and constant restraining process with the other branches. By this, it seems that all those contradictions and fears are solved which arise from the analysis of Rousseau, who recognizes the importance of the existence of a body of this kind. Rousseau sees the tribunate as a necessity which will exist only in a situation where his own solution to the problem of inequality, to the lack of liberty, does not succeed in bringing the general will, as distinguished from the will of all, to realization, whether for reasons of natural degeneration or others. His basic approach is that the unjust social order based on inequality must be replaced with an institution of legitimate political authority intended to preserve individual liberty, and its basis is indeed in the legislative branch. But for me, from a conceptual perspective of his own theory, it can definitely be argued that in a state of historical development in which those institutions that solve the problem in a primary or other way in a certain period are incapable of solving it in its formation in other days, it is appropriate to place in the hands of society an institution of political authority which will not be detached from the will of the sovereign, as well as from the needs of action, but rather draws from them and is integrated with the institutions through which success was not achieved. Specifically, the fourth branch, characterized by a certain goal, corrective and preservative as one, which is separate from the rest of the existing branches and yet maintains with them reciprocal relations of balance and checking, which is legislative and executive as one, but in those areas that are not within the authority of the other existing branches, can constitute a cure for Rousseau's fears, and all this while lending a collective ear to his fears and reservations. As distinguished from reservations regarding the very establishment of the fourth branch and the need for it, behold, Rousseau's reservations, like those of the other scholars above, are worthy to be taken into account regarding the specific implementation of the fourth branch, as well as the advantage found in our possession of a historical empirical perspective regarding the development of modern democratic society.
מעמדה של הטריבונה ביחס למוסדות הבסיס של האמנה החברתית.
After the discussion on the basis of Rousseau's outlook regarding the realization of the general will in the institutions of the state, it is appropriate to attend to the matter of the status of the fourth branch in relation to the other branches, through an analogy and a discussion of the status of the tribunate as opposed to the traditional branches. Rousseau explicitly notes that the institutions derived from the social contract do not include an active corrective body, or one that focuses on matters of equality and distribution. These matters are part of the built-in role of the legislative branch of the people. The tribunate was intended to correct a situation into which society was drawn, among other things, when dealing with the problem of determining a suitable ratio between the parts constituting society, or when causes that cannot be abolished constantly change the relationship between them. Since it concerns a corrective body regarding the ratio between the institutions, and not a body that is part of the institutions as they are, certainly not equal in formal status toward them from a value perspective, and also so that it will not accumulate unnecessary power and thereby harm the institutional fabric derived from the contract, it is appropriate that that institution possess only a delaying power and not an executive or legislative power, and even that its action be limited in time, interrupted and renewed only according to necessity. If it does not act so, behold, power of such a kind is likely to aspire to expand and thereby act contrary to the collection of wills and lead to the disintegration of the state. The answer to this claim must be divided in two, and first it must be noted that Rousseau's argument suffers, in my view, from an internal logical problem. The reason for his proposal to establish the tribunate is rooted in the built-in need of the city for the adjustment of the proportions between its parts. This adjustment is required due to the natural process of power struggles between the executive and legislative branches, without referring to its natural process of degeneration, like that of any governmental body. It is clear that at some stage, fast or slow, a problem of lack of proportions in the distribution of power between the institutions will be created. Certainly in large states where an elected aristocratic rule or a rule of representatives will exist, which will necessarily become a rule of an elected aristocracy over time, and with the intensification of their own power and that of the descendants of those who were once the most talented, as well as the remaining of the government structure as it is. If indeed it concerns a built-in problem of the city, why propose a solution that creates a built-in problem as it is? Rousseau proposes to us to be content as a solution with an institution that is not elected as it is, and also does not execute, and which, due to the respect that the people will acquire toward it, the branches will agree, according to its guidance, to waive their excessive power which they accumulated during such and other bitter struggles. And not only that, but they will also appoint it from time to time when their power reaches that excessive stage, etc. On its face, it seems that it concerns a refuted claim that requires correction. Furthermore, Rousseau does not bother to pour real content regarding the structure and action of the tribunate as it is, and in relation to the existing institutions. Thus, for example, he does not explain what that same delaying power of this officership is, how it will act, for example, for the correction of the gaps between the people and the aristocracy, or the prince, by virtue of what, according to what, how it will cope with those same forces in society controlling existing institutions, which naturally will oppose its action, as far as this will harm in a real manner their control, when because of this control of theirs, the establishment of that same officership was required in the first place. The core of his argument and analysis is how to restrict the steps of that same body that has not yet been established at all. Moreover, according to Rousseau, the problem of the lack of suitable proportion between the constituent parts of the state, namely, the sovereign, the subjects, and the prince, is a built-in and natural problem, requiring on the one hand, a prince strong enough so that he can rule over large peoples, and on the other hand, a sovereign strong enough so that the people's will be expressed while restraining the prince. And if indeed such is the case, and it concerns a built-in problem, why wait until this problem worsens and endangers the republic, and then establish a body without real authorities? Furthermore, is it conceivable that the correction of the natural behavior of the prince regarding the corruption of power, or the increasing of the power of the sovereign will be done in a real and exhaustive manner, certainly in a manner that is more substantive than marginal, by a body to which everyone yields an apparent respect, and which is devoid of real authorities. And it is superfluous to note that the conceptual reservation discussed here received practical expression in all those institutions which can be apparently assigned to that same officership within the framework of Western democracy, and which, as a fact, did not prove themselves in a substantive manner, at least regarding the issue at hand, the state comptroller, a second house within the parliaments, etc. There is no doubt that one of the phenomena of the lack of proper proportions between the parts of the state is the problem of social gaps. As stated, Rousseau himself says, indeed in a footnote, but one that does not leave room for two interpretations, that the system of laws within the framework of the existing institutions, according to the social contract itself, has in it, in a certain socio-material state, which he defines as a bad government, the capacity to fix and deepen social inequality. This is a natural phenomenon within the framework of the degeneration of the social order, when the few are those possessing influence and possessing enjoyment, while most of the public is pushed to a corner. A built-in reality such as this can and must be solved by a structural reform of a type different from that proposed by Rousseau. As far as matters concern the basic assumptions of this work, it is clear that a toothless institution, even if it has in its hand to delay laws or their execution in some way, which is ad hoc or at least temporary, when also that determination regarding the time for its establishment and by whom it is made are not mentioned by Rousseau, which is not part of the city, to which respect is yielded, etc., will not have in it the capacity to correct the laws as they are, or those institutions acting for the benefit of the money owners in society, who it is reasonable to assume will not allow an institution devoid of real power to violate the material paradise they reached, and which they want to preserve and even to expand. From here it follows that that same officership must necessarily possess a power greater than a power of mere respect or delay, which even if in some initial state of the time of its establishment it is possible, it will have a certain weight. Behold, in the expected power struggles with the constituent institutions, it is probable that even this power will dissipate. Furthermore, as far as it concerns a body that is elected by the public and has executive capabilities, like the proposed branch, then the basic problem to which Rousseau refers in his fears regarding the tribunate being necessarily outside the city, so that the will of the collective will not be channeled by an external institution, will be solved. A solution of this type will also dissipate Rousseau's fears regarding the intensification of this external body, since its being part of the city will place in its hand the possibility for constant change towards suitable proportions between the parts of the city, and likewise will also require it to participate in that same struggle, in that same competition, in that same constant social process toward a correct and worthy social balance that will stand in one line with the general will and with the values of civil liberty. The fourth authority comes, therefore, to provide an answer also to this lack in the reality claimed in the basic assumptions of this work, as well as to Rousseau's fear regarding the increasing of the power of that officership, which is likely to harm the social fabric. For purposes of influence and legitimacy, it must therefore be part of the city. For purposes of balance, it must be well planted in the existing and acting checking and restraining mechanisms between the existing institutions, but this time out of an intention of correction, narrowing the gaps. A real and regulated concern for the socio-economically weaker layers in a society that changes its priorities and returns to its sources. To checking the consistent takeover by capital owners of the institutions of the shrinking state.
הגו, בגלל המדינה הכוללת.
Beyond the historical background to Hegel's thought, including the intellectual opposition to the terror that accompanied the French Revolution, and which was perceived as a return to the Hobbesian state of nature, Hegel saw a place to oppose Rousseau's social contract, not from utilitarian empiricist reasons such as those of Hume, but rather from an opposite direction, of the lack existing according to his method in the focus on the will of the individual. This will, as well as the private interest, is perceived by Hegel as subjectivism that does not embody within it the general truth inherent in man's aspiration for liberty. Liberty will be achieved in the integration between the interest, or the private will, and the social existence of man as a social creature, or the essential universal will, which will come to an ideal expression in the state which is the actuality of the substantive will, when it rises to the level of universality, when it is rational for itself and in itself. Hegel saw the subjective focus on the individual as leading on the one hand to chaos, as far as matters concern the framework of the state, and on the other hand to poverty and the rule of the few when it concerns the focus on civil society. Without canceling the importance of civil society and the autonomy required for it, also in the sense of the free market and private property, as well as the importance of the basic institution, the family, he sees the solution to the injustices and conflicts derived from focusing on the individual in seeing the comprehensive, rational ideal picture for a human society, which is the state, containing within it both civil society and the family within an objective ideal totality. The solution to the severe injustices derived from focusing on civil society, in the hidden action of the market and in the takeover by the few of the means of production, as a dialectic between poverty and wealth leading to unbearable gaps in society, in wealth and power, Hegel sees in the functioning of the state and its intervention, which constitutes in practice its central role. But how this correction shall be made, Hegel has no real practical solutions, mainly because he does not see fit a possibility to harm the autonomy of civil society. Hegel's liberal affinity for the free market caused him to think that the severe injustices to which he points could not be solved in a clear and absolute manner, and that inequality can only be narrowed or reduced through education, imposing taxes for the sake of helping the poor, supervision of prices, and the establishment of suitable institutions, which he does not note what they are. And again, how this matter shall be made when the wealthy minority controls the capital and social power, Hegel has no real solutions. Into this void others will of course enter, like Marx, who will move the focus of interest from the totality of the state to that of civil society, the market, while aspiring to the cancellation of the basis of these injustices according to his method, namely, private property which enables the rule of the few over the capital and means of production. The solution, then, for the dialectical reality of rule or decisive influence of capital owners from within civil society in the liberal capitalist society, which is in the nature of an assumption in this work, is supposed to arrive from another direction. I do not know if there is or is not cause to come to Hegel with historical claims regarding leaving this conceptual vacuum, for the institutional structure proposed by him for the state was rooted in the political reality in which he lived and in reaction to the historical events that accompanied the French Revolution. But his proposal for a constitutional monarchy as the ideal state in which all the spheres are embodied, unity by the formal monarch, the people's will by the legislative branch, divided into a House of Representatives according to classes and a House of Lords, and the judiciary, constitutes, according to his own method, a matter subject to change according to the development of the historical dialectic as it is. My claim in this chapter will therefore be that specifically the fourth authority constitutes a worthy completion to the totality requested by Hegel of human society, and in practice, from his point of view, a sort of Hegelian development or completion with necessary changes, a social and not general definition of the idea of the tribunates, or of the independent supervisory authority, which is not rooted in the private will, but its foundation is in society, in the balancing and checking of the utilitarian authority by focusing on the needs and in changing the conditions of the weak, toward narrowing the social gaps to the maximum as a problem, and therefore also a need for a solution of the entire society. This completion does not cancel civil society or private property, and even does not move the totality requested by Hegel from the state to civil society, but rather it supervises it, audits it, and limits it within a system of mutual checks and balances, that do not allow the fourth branch to constitute a government within a government, but rather an additional and integral branch with the other branches. In a reality of elite rule, of which Hegel warned with great clarity, the rational objective state as a conceptual totality has an intervening role, while carefully preserving the fabric of institutions required for the sake of social unity and the preservation of its supreme goal, the liberty of man, which integrates his personal interest with his being a member of the community of others. My claim here will be that Hegel had no ability in the fabric of times and challenges that stood before him to reach a different arrangement of the institutional structure of liberal society, certainly liberal democratic, which did not rule the roost in those times, but constituted one of the existing regimes, and not among the most frequent of them. Specifically, the German Empire, which is perhaps the historical source of the welfare state, led in its development to disasters much more severe than those of the French Revolution. And in any case, the welfare state in the single superpower democratic liberal era is situated in a severe problem. Even if the fourth authority does not appear in a real manner in the existing state institutions, behold, it is an integral part of the ideal of the state, if such exists, requiring objective totality, which maintains in an ideal manner the individual's good. The spirit of the fourth branch, as it is situated in all those parts of the previous state in forms of torn fragments, whether within the framework of civil society, as volunteer and philanthropy organizations, whether within the framework of state authorities, for example in the welfare state, or in the social departments and institutions in the liberal executive branch, when its dispersal among parts of society in an uncontrolled and unfocused manner does not prove itself regarding its results. Specifically, objective totality requires that beyond civil society and state authorities, whose role is the preservation of liberty and social stability, one branch shall be established within the framework of the state, which will encourage, supervise, and promote the beautiful and important social acts, which are today like a drop in the disappointing sea of social gaps.
על פתרונות של עוצמה אוניברסלית, המשטרה, תיווך אזרחי, בעלי ההון, וסולידריות אזרחית, הקורפורציה. תהליך היסטורי כשלעצמו, על פני הרפתקה בת סיכון.
The foundation of Hegel's thought is in the fear of instability and lawlessness that is likely to be embodied in a state of all its citizens, in a state of the private will. Therefore, the first argument against the establishment of the fourth branch will be from the direction of the fear of a development that is not historical built-in, one that is not gradual and is not rooted in the harmony embodied in the modern state in its three spheres: the family, the civil society, and the sovereign. It is not true at all that Hegel does not propose a solution to the problem of civil society when it lacks supervision, namely, the social gaps. Hegel's solutions are not false illusions. They are not hocus-pocus solutions, which possess, as is known, a non-negligible dimension of danger to the stability of the regime. In the nature of adventures whose outcome we will not know until the individual's suffering due to the additional and detached institutions which cast upon him their terror and lack of efficiency, will cause him further despair and giving up in the face of the injustices of civil society as it is. Hegel's solutions appear perhaps somewhat conservative, perhaps lacking the revolutionary brilliance of Marx or the sharpness of Mill, but the dialectical action between those recommended, possible, and natural mechanisms of the state, that vital dimension of the sovereign protecting the fabric of society against instability, fear of rebellion, and enabling the regular action of civil society, acting in a universal objective manner, namely, the police, the violence, and of the responsible civil society in its universal subjective dimension, namely, the corporations and the owners of stable capital, the estates, have in them, in a historical, gradual, built-in, and necessary process, the capacity to lead toward the state as an ideal, toward a harmony that is built of itself and for itself, toward a point of rest, a proper balance which is a necessity in the integration between the particular and the universal, between the subject and the object. Indeed, it is not a matter of a clear solution, but a slow process, which unnatural and detached attempts will seek to sink like a reef in a stormy sea. But the quasi-conservative persistence in enabling a historical, objective, comprehensive development of that comprehensive liberty is what will enable in the fullness of time to bring a cure to the problem we are discussing. The corporations are those associations which enable civil society its universal existence. Those guilds that preserve and promote the professions as they are through professional theories as well as ethical rules, creating brotherhood and partnership between the professionals, which are beyond their particular matters and they themselves. Together with the sovereign, the owners of stable capital, preventing rebellion and enabling the dialectical dance between the substantive parts of society, will enable the requested solution to the problem in question. The response to this argument is integrated between the basic principles of Hegel's theory and its being contrary to the historical empirical experience upon which it seeks to be built, as well as to the basic assumptions within the framework of this work, which also from Hegel's point of view teach of this empirical failure. Furthermore, it is important in my opinion to examine why this proposal of Hegel's did not succeed, and to ask aloud whether, according to his writings, fundamentally different conclusions can be drawn for the solution of the problem of social gaps within the process of the comprehensive universal state, or whether the fourth branch is a solution that fits the bases of his theory more than his own solution. First and foremost, it is worthy to attend to the bases of Hegel's theory and not to the assumptions regarding the reasons for which he reached these foundations, which are a matter for speculation that he also tries to obscure, or at most, to the author's intention in context of his time, and not to finding the seemingly universal relevant principles of his theory when we come to examine the possible implications of the core of his theory for our reality, which is undoubtedly different from the reality in which he himself and for himself lived. Therefore, it is worthy first to note that the basis of Hegel's theory is the rational, universal basic right which he seeks to bring to realization. And it is of course liberty, which receives with him a dual meaning of negative liberty, the individual's freedoms, and positive, social, which gathers under its wings the particular and the universal of the adult and mature human within the basic framework of human history, namely, the state. This realization must be examined according to the basic unit of his thought. This is not the corporation, or the landowners, or the police, which he sees as tools of his time, that possess the possibility for channeling the ailments of civil society as he identifies them toward the universal, toward the actualization of that same social right and duty of man, the comprehensive liberty. The state is the perfection, according to Hegel, as a totality containing within it both the two non-political spheres and the political one as one. The state reaches the exhaustion of its objective character from within itself and as itself, when social liberty reaches the highest degree. All this through the realization of this right into its institutions. It concerns a dialectical historical process between the opposing forces in society. The subjects creating by the nature of their essence antagonism to the universal, like civil society, while it is in itself a means for achieving the actualization of liberty, as distinguished from the framework which is the state, are subject and even mandatory to change according to the circumstances of time and place in which the historical state develops. The proof is that even according to Hegel himself, these means which he specifies are not the only ones regarding the universalization of civil society. Certainly they did not exist since forever, but they are those envisioned in his eyes, from his point of view, in his reality, as the optimal means for achieving this destiny. And in a concrete manner, it is worthy to note that the integration between the violence in the hand of the sovereign and between the professional representatives of civil society, for example, representatives of the industrialists, the capital owners, representatives of the workers, cannot constitute a suitable solution by definition, according to the basic assumptions of this work. The matters were detailed in the introduction to this work, but I will add and note that the reason for this is first and foremost their control and decisive influence of the capital owners in the two spheres in question, namely in the civil authority as well as in the state authorities. This state of affairs returns us from Hegel's thought to a reality in which civil society, tending toward the particular, is the dominant entity, a process leading necessarily to disaster due to the control of the particular and the fading of the universal in society. In this state of affairs, the capital owners will agree to cooperation, especially with the representatives of the workers who are becoming increasingly weak in an era of technological development and globalization. Only where this will contribute first and foremost to such stability which will enable the continuation of their profits and certainly their increasing, as distinguished from stability that has in it also as a correction of real substance to the situation of social gaps. The principle of the invisible hand, the action of the market in the absence of direction from above, acts properly for the promotion of society where that same direction in itself is reduced toward the neutralizing of deviations such as corruption or monopoly. A place where in practice a monopoly exists, behold, by definition, there is no real free market to be found. Such are also the appearances of things in a civil society controlled in all its limbs by capital owners, and not by those same corporations, whether Hegel intended in them the middle class alone, or whether we interpret them as consistent with all the classes. The labor unions are not associated as one real mass, but they are separate for each and every field, while they themselves are often close to the plate and worry for their specific sectors and mainly for their own plate. Their power in a universal systemic manner within the state is becoming increasingly weak with the intensification of privatization in the economy. The fourth authority is situated within the historical process of the rational free development of the state as an ideal according to Hegel. Even Hegel as himself proposes to us an institution that does not exist in practice in his time, certainly not in the manner that he requests that we accept it. And it is the institution of the corporations in civil society, out of recognition that civil society, as it is, conducted according to the particular principle, its end is that it will lead to social chaos. Even Hegel himself agrees that the modern state develops, does not freeze upon its guard, and all this toward a universal objective reality-actuality, containing the particular and the collective as one. The proposed institutions of the fourth branch are scattered today in a manner that does not enable the universal social foundations of the state to sprout. The state, at least according to the basic assumptions of this work, is conducted today in a manner that is particular for the benefit of the capital owners. And regarding this matter, an end must be put in a historical, gradual manner, which is not revolutionary, but natural, at least according to the position of Hegel himself. Furthermore, if the branches act out of a self-essence and not in the comprehensive universal context, behold the rational state as stated, its end is to perish. In practice, we are situated today, according to Hegel, in a state in which civil society is that which gives the tone in the entire society regarding its values and the controllers in it. Hegel himself points out, perhaps in an esoteric manner, but certainly in a manner that does not leave room for two interpretations toward this built-in problem. But he does not propose any real or visible solution to this issue, and his theory, as it is, does not contradict at this point the proposal before us.
על התמקצעות בחברה האזרחית ובשירות הציבורי. התפתחות מבפנים אל מול החשש לאי-יציבות פסיבית, שיתוק, או אקטיבית, ערעור הרמוניית המשטר.
An argument of a different type against the establishment of the fourth authority may be from the direction of the internal, historical universal development of those institutions in civil society and in the public service, upon which the welfare and ways of life of the citizens depend. My intention in this argument is to the natural, ethical, particular professional, and universal communal development as one of these institutions, which is comprehensive in this sense that it turns both to the aspects of efficiency and the quality of professional service as they are, and to the aspects of internal and external disciplinary ethics. When these aspects are operated in sharp concert in those institutions, they have in them the capacity to influence the welfare of the citizens and the gaps in society. This as distinguished from the proposal placed at the doorstep of this work, namely, to establish a forced and coerced artificial body of the kind of the fourth branch. This internal development concerns both the public authorities, such as in the ministries of education, economy, in the welfare authorities, in municipal services, and in civil society, beginning from the corporations dealing in a direct manner with the affairs of the weak, such as labor unions, or with the affairs of the strong, such as chambers of commerce, industrial associations, through voluntary institutions, non-profits, the philanthropy of capital owners, and ending with the actual financial institutions of capital owners, which deal with welfare matters in an indirect manner, through such or another communal contribution. When the direct professional and ethical needs as one of all the institutions, both in civil society and in the public service, meet one another, out of their rational universal progress as they are, then the problem of social gaps must necessarily come to its satisfaction, if not to its solution, at least from aspects of mere general social stability. The reason for this claim is rooted in the fact that the moment the universal recognition is situated in the responsible institutions of civil society, which, as they are, regarding their members' affairs, act in a universal objective manner, and likewise it is situated in the institutions of the state as it is, then this responsible communal integration of the constituent parts of society cannot but be required for the solution of the problem of social gaps, which threatens by definition the stability of society, and leads those possessing despair toward the regions of civil rebellion. As distinguished from this gradual internal development, the core of which is the emphasis on the ethical rules of the existing bodies and institutions in civil society, behold, a solution of the kind of the fourth branch is likely to paralyze the state institutions in a whirlpool of jurisdictional disputes, the loading of additional bureaucracy, which naturally will continue and gain momentum and volume with time, and from here, paralysis in a state of balanced forces, or the violation of the regime's harmony due to an accumulation of excess power. However, again, I cannot accept this argument as well, both from an empirical, historical point of view, and certainly according to the basic assumptions of this work, and also from within Hegel's theory itself. First, it is worthy to note that Hegel's view regarding the inability of civil society alone to channel society toward the implementation of its main goal is built-in and basic. The state is the actuality of the ethical idea and not civil society. And as for the development of state institutions, behold, according to Hegel, they, as they are supposed to act in an ethical, universal manner. If they stand in the criterion of rationalism, which he seeks to accept, regarding the activity of government officials as a built-in, obvious assumption. Therefore, the ethical, professional, and communal development of the state institutions, as they are, has not in it enough to provide a solution to the built-in antagonism problem of civil society, since there must be a coercive, supervisory, and constructive connection of the universal over the actual, namely, such that is on the level of power and not on the level of morality alone. When the state's institutions act in a rational manner and in such a structure that copes with the built-in civil antagonism, especially in such a reality as presented in this work, behold, naturally, there will be to this a direct implication on the moral values of the individuals and of civil society as a consequence of the protection of the social liberty of the individual. Civil society and the state act hand in hand in Hegel's state as non-political and political institutions complementing each other toward a rational harmony, a unity maintaining a principle, and not a unity preferring one over the other. The professional guilds were proven to be controlled in practice by capital owners, and especially severe are the matters at the intersections influencing decision-making in society. If, for example, we are dealing with the free professions, behold, it concerns usually those same professionals who serve the capital owners and become capital owners themselves. If it concerns labor unions, behold, they do not function in a comprehensive universal manner, but in a remarkably particular manner that preserves, in cases of the large unions, mainly their own rights as well as the particular rights of their workers, which sometimes come at the expense of the collective, and certainly do not promote the problems of the weak unions. The matters were proven, for example, in Israel during the great crisis of non-payment of salaries for about a year and a half among weak bodies, such as local religious councils and local councils. The apparent intervention was done in a strange manner, only after an unexplained suffering of about a year and a half, and even that from considerations that cannot be explained as ethical professionalization considerations. If it concerns the media, which is supposed to be the watchdog of democracy, behold, it is controlled entirely by capital owners. And to such an extent did matters reach until honorable members of the Israel Press Council found it proper to resign from it, while protesting due to the exclusion done according to them in the press, regarding all matters that do not fit the neoliberal agenda. This development in the institutions of civil society stands on the same scale with Hegel's view regarding the inability of civil society, due to its character and the built-in particular motivations of its components, which do not enable it to bring by itself the dimension of social liberty to implementation. Furthermore, as already noted above, the takeover by civil society of the state constitutes a real danger to its existence. And as for the professional bureaucracy as well as the elected among the sovereign, behold, experience teaches that in a reality of such decisive influence of capital owners over the state, privatized from its assets and its duties, and over the rest of its components, behold, contrary to Hegel's claim that it will be committed to pure activity for the benefit of society due to its exposure to public criticism, behold, in practice, it casts its eyes almost constantly toward the day after, toward that same day in which it, if it did not do so in a seemingly legitimate or illegitimate corruption while it was inside the system, will do so when it goes out free to the warm arms of those who were served by it from within. Here it is worthy to return and emphasize that Hegel referred both to the governmental bureaucracy and to the influential factors in civil society, such as the estate owners and the corporations, as far as it concerns the functioning defined by him as rational, namely, that it is directed to the promotion of the principle of social particular and universal liberty as one. There is no doubt, and he also notes this explicitly, that the takeover by one class over the state is a real disaster. When public officials act out of a deep and comprehensive view regarding the nature of the state's organism and its needs, and they are chosen according to their skills for the government's business, etc. When estate owners act by virtue of their will in the preservation and cultivation of the communal stability in which they live, and the responsibility derived from their power and stable status toward the comprehensive needs of society, or when the corporations are directed to promote the affairs of the individuals associated within them, certainly those who need help and guidance and basic equality of opportunity, behold, the state progresses in the right direction. But when these vital institutions act out of a certain, specific particular interest of such or another class, of themselves as they are, certainly of a narrow sector within them, and not of the comprehensive society as it is, behold, society progresses toward robbery, loot, and dismantling. There is no escape, therefore, from the rejection of the argument of ethical, professional, and universal development as it is, as a solution to the problem of social gaps from within the existing system as it is, as distinguished from a systemic development different from within the comprehensive system as it is, as distinguished from dispersed developments from within the existing subsystems. The fourth branch as a rational institution in a rational society is an institutional possibility for the adjustment of society's aspiration to the realization of the actualization of the right of comprehensive liberty, both private and social. The manner of the design of the actuality will be correct for each and every society in a different way. Once the fourth branch is established in its format, behold the rational reciprocal action between it and the other rational institutions constituting the state authorities, between the non-political or semi-political spheres, namely the family and civil society, will have a decisive influence on the design of each and every society according to its conditions, its circumstances, and its reasons in the aspiration toward the realization of the comprehensive liberty of the individual, both subjective and objective as one.